Recently, some of you got in touch with me about a video by two food wellness influencers that essentially claimed that your breast cancer risk could be largely modulated by diet, and implicitly that you'd be responsible for it if it didn't. This upset a lot of people, and people had questions, so I'm going to do a bit of a video here where I take some of those claims apart or try to put them in context, and I also talk about the fact that we need to stop blaming people for incidences of cancer. Cancer is not a moral failing, it is a disease. And it's not because you did anything wrong that you got it. So, without further ado, I'm going to start breaking this down point by point.
1 in 7 women in the UK and other high income countries will get a diagnosis of breast cancer in their lifetime, versus 1 in 100 in Hong Kong, versus 1 in 1,000 in China. Some of the
Unpack. Firstly, it's called the ecological fallacy to compare two groups that way without correcting for all the other factors that you would have to do. In this case, these are being compared naively, which makes absolutely no sense. Cancer, for example, is primarily a disease of aging. A woman in her 60s has about 100 times the breast cancer risk of a woman in her 20s. So comparing populations without that kind of standardization and cross comparison doesn't make any sense. More than that, I think more critical to this, is that there are different factors in different countries that influence things that you have to be aware of. For example, greater life expectancy, more screening, different age of giving birth and fertility and breastfeeding, because a lot of breast cancers are hormonally mediated. You have to make these adjustments. So to naively compare two things this way is misleading and irresponsible. Also, that 1 in 7 figure that's quoted there is at best extremely wrong. And that's because that's talking about cumulative incidence. That's not diagnosis, that is incidence, how often this might happen. If you live long enough, you will start to develop cancer. Cancer is the accumulation of mutations. If you, on an autopsy table, look at someone in their 90s, they will, if they're a woman, they'll have the beginnings of breast cancer. If they're a man, they'll have the beginnings of prostate cancer, at the very least. This is a consequence of aging. So that's cumulative incidence in the Western world. That is not the same thing, and it's irresponsible to make that comparison, and wrong.
Some of the possible factors are excessive saturated fat intake, excessive dairy product, and excessive animal products intake.
This is the kind of nonsense I really despise. Firstly, the evidence base on dairy and breast cancer is incredibly inconsistent and mainly spurious. There are studies that find drinking milk and eating cheese decrease your breast cancer risk. There are some that found it might increase it. Overall, it's noise. There is no consistent literature making a confident assertion like this, because the results and the effects are probably very, very little, and that's why we're seeing an awful lot of noise around it, if any effect exists at all. That goes the same for meat. There are some studies that might find that red meat might slightly increase risk. There's other studies that find eating poultry and chicken products decrease your breast cancer risk. And again, you're dancing on the edge of significance, you're dancing on the end of spurious things. A confident statement about this is just wrong. Again, the dietary fats hypothesis, which is much beloved of a lot of cranks, has been pretty much shown to be incredibly weak for many, many years and widely considered refuted.
Things to reduce your risk. Aim for a healthy body weight. Eat mostly whole food, plant-based. Aim for 8 to 13 portions of fruit and veg per day. Reduce alcohol consumption. Avoid smoking. Move regularly.
I often find when you're dealing with what some authors call nutribolics that you often get relatively good advice sprinkled with absolute nonsense. So it is absolutely true there is a link between obesity and breast cancer, and all cancers indeed. And there's a lot of different reasons for that I've written on before, but it involves mainly having excess fat cells, which have their own problems, and also the hormonal signaling that can cause. But the idea that suddenly you have to eat a plant-based diet to avoid this is not evidence-based. That's just wrong. So avoid keeping a healthy body weight. Yeah, fantastic, great. We should all strive for that for a variety of reasons. To say that you need to eat soy products all the time, that is not supported by the evidence whatsoever. There is very limited data to support that kind of contention, and particularly giving frequencies like 2 to 3 times a day. That is nonsense. Of course, reducing smoking is probably one of the biggest things you can do to to reduce your cancer risk and keeping active, and that's all good advice. But it's been buttressed by a lot of very confident and very wrong assertions.
Eat mushrooms reduces your risk of breast cancer. Eat soy products 2 to 3 times per day.
The thing about the mushrooms I find a bit strange. I presume they're basing that confident assertion of studies like this, because there's very limited data on this, and that's a problem because limited data in medicine is not how you make good policy decisions or good medical decisions. Also, this paper in particular, I would have found a lot of flaws with the methods section. But one of my pet hates about this stuff is the idea that you're responsible for your cancer, that you can just eat a healthy diet or do this or do that and you're not going to get cancer. That is nonsense. Cancer is mainly a disease of stochasticity. It has a huge random element. You can do everything right and still get cancer, or you can have the least healthy lifestyle in the world and never get cancer. Your modifiable risk for breast cancer, that is the amount of risk that you can control by doing everything right or wrong, is about 30%. That means 70% is just down to luck. And yes, it is always good to do things like maintain a healthy body weight and not smoke and not drink to excess or not get too much sunlight exposure. Loads of things we can do to kind of control our risk. But there are so many factors in breast cancer that are hereditary or hormonal or societal that we cannot control. And I think it shames people unnecessarily and it makes food a moral thing too. It's like, oh, if you eat the good food, you'll be fine. And you eat the bad food, well, you kind of deserve it. And you would be surprised by the amount of patients I have talked to that have struggled with guilt over thinking that they're responsible for their cancer when they are not. And I know this might be a reassuring comfort blanket for people to think, oh, if I just eat well, I'll never get cancer. And you're wrong. And it's not helpful. So I think that this kind of stuff, what may be well intentioned is really irresponsible. And I think people that are essentially making their career hawking lifestyle foods should maybe think a little bit more or be a bit more responsible before they do this kind of stuff. Because it's not a fair burden to put on people.